Hello, my name's Andrew Norton and I'm in the Astronomy Research Group at the Open University. In this talk, I'm going to tell you about variable stars and a way in which you can get involved in some research that I'm doing to identify new variable stars and search for particularly rare examples. So let me start with my slides. My talk's called Data Mining the SuperWASP Variable Star Population. And it's work that I've done over the past few years with some postgraduate students, several years ago Marcus Law, and then Paul Greer, and currently Heidi Tiemann. So SuperWASP was the Wide Angle Search for Planets, a project designed to search for planets around other stars, exoplanets. But as I'll show you, one of the spin-offs of this whole project was the identification of a huge number of newly identified variable stars. So SuperWASP is shown here on the right. This is an image of one of the installations. We had two installations like this, one in La Palma in the Canary Islands, observing the Northern Hemisphere sky, and one in South Africa, observing the Southern Hemisphere. And as you can see, it's not really like a typical telescope. In fact, there are 8 cameras on a single robotic mount here. Each of these cameras is rather small, about 14 centimeters in diameter aperture, but has a very wide field of view, typically about 8 degrees across. That's 16 times the diameter of the full moon. So with the 8 telescopes observing together, we cover an area of sky about 500 square degrees, which means in a single snapshot, we can capture an image of many hundreds of thousands of stars. And over the course of about 11 years that SuperWASP was operating, we observed essentially the whole sky, night after night, year after year, and many times per night. So the image on the left shows a map of the sky showing the colors there, the density of stars. And in fact, the sort of green U-shaped region there is a plot of the Milky Way, the band of our galaxy on the sky, where the stars are closer together. And in fact, SuperWASP didn't observe the very densest parts of the Milky Way because the stars are simply too close together to be resolved individually with these rather small telescopes. But nonetheless, over the rest of the sky, over the course of about 11 years, we observed over 30 million stars, many times per night, night after night, month after month, year after year. So the data that we build up on all these stars is unique in 2 ways. It's first got a long baseline extending over the 11 years, and the data also have a short cadence. So that's many observations per object per night. And this is ideal for studying variable stars, as I'll show you. So first of all, what we do is extract light curves from these SuperWASP data. That means essentially measuring the brightness of every star in every image and joining those measurements together to make a light curve, as shown here. So on the left, there's an image of the sky in false color with an individual star ringed with a green circle. And all we do is measure the brightness of that star in every image and then plot all those brightness measurements as in the graph at the top. And that's a light curve of this particular star spanning, 7 years from 2007 to 2014. Each dot is a measurement of the brightness of that star at a particular time on a particular night. And if we zoom in on 1 month of data in the middle panel, you can see each little stripe of dots is 1 night's worth of data. And then if we zoom in just on 3 of those nights, you can now begin to see that this particular star is varying in brightness. You can see the brightness goes up and down in a fairly regular manner. And typically for each of these 30 million or so stars that we've measured light curves for, we would have around 20,000 data points per object. So having got those light curves, we need to then analyze them to look for particular types of variable stars, pulsating stars and eclipsing binary stars, which I'll explain in a moment. Now, any signal, like a light curve, we can analyze it to find what frequencies, what periods are present in it. We call that process taking a Fourier transform of the data, and it's illustrated schematically here. So on the left is a light curve shown by that red trace, and it goes up and down in some kind of regular manner, but it's difficult to see what signals are present in that red light curve alone. But by this mathematical technique, we can break it down into its component frequencies, its component periods. And that's shown by the three purple tracers stacked behind it. As you see, each of those has a different frequency, perhaps a different amplitude. And if we add those three purple tracers together, we get back to the red light curve that we started with. And we can display that information, the three periods, the three frequencies that are present, as in the blue graph on the right. This is in the frequency domain where we plot the amplitude of the signal against its frequency. And there are three spikes in this particular example, showing that there are three signals, three particular frequencies present in these data, and we can measure what those frequencies are, measure what the amplitudes are, and so understand what variation has gone into creating that light curve in the first place. So the sorts of signals we're looking for are shown here. These are two particular types of variable stars. At the top then is an eclipsing binary star. This is where we have essentially two stars orbiting around their common center of mass. And from our viewpoint, one of the stars passes in front of the other, and then vice versa, as they orbit each other. And if the stars have different brightnesses, as in the example shown here, we get a fairly characteristic light curve that repeats in a regular manner, with first a deep primary eclipse, as we call it, and then a shallow secondary eclipse. And that repeats periodically as the two stars orbit each other with this regularly repeating motion. And that orbital period of the two stars could be as short as a couple of hours, or even less in some cases, up to many days, months, or even years. At the bottom is another type of variable star. This is a so-called pulsating star, where we have a single star which is physically pulsating in and out, getting brighter and fainter, hotter and cooler, larger and smaller as it does so. And the light output therefore varies in the manner shown, typically with a steep rise in brightness and then a shallow fall in brightness, which again repeats on a regular cycle. It might be as short as a few hours, might be as long as many years. Different sorts of pulsating star, different sorts of eclipsing binary star that we can try and find within these 30 million light curves from SuperWASP. Now, what SuperWASP is good for with all these many, many light curves is first of all finding rare individual objects, such as the one I'm going to tell you about here, and also studying whole classes of objects where we can find many thousands of the same type. And I'll tell you about that in a moment. But here then is really my favorite of all the new variable stars that we found with SuperWASP over the years. This particular light curve of this particular star, which goes by the name 1 SuperWASP J 09301 2.84, and so on, as you can see. When we looked at this light curve and made its power spectrum using the Fourier transform that I just talked about, we found that it had two distinct signals in it. One signal at a period of 5.5 hours and another signal at a period of 1.3 days. So what we did with the light curve was fold it at each of those two periods. By folding it, we mean taking, say, a 5.5 hour segment of the light curve, overlaying it on the next 5.5 hours, and the next, and so on, till we'd folded the entire light curve to lay on top of each other in that 5.5 hour period. And what we got when we did that is shown in the top left here. I showed two cycles of it, but you can see a very clear regular repeating pattern that recurs every 5.5 hours. And what this is a characteristic light curve of a very close eclipsing binary, where the two stars are so close together that as they orbit around each other, we see a continuous variation in light. And the sort of star that might be like is shown at the top right of the diagram, where you see the two stars distorted into these sort of pear shape, that they're physically in contact. And as they orbit around each other, so we get this different projection of their surface brightness, and we get this continuous variation in light, repeating every 5.5 hours. 5.5 hours is just the time it takes for the two stars to go around each other. But then in that same light curve, when we folded it at the longer period of 1.3 days, we got the light curve shown in the bottom left. And here you can see there are very narrow dips, a deep narrow dip and a rather shallow narrow dip. But again, they repeat, in this case, every 1.3 days. So what we have here is shown in the bottom right diagram, where we have two stars that are separated from each other, orbiting around each other every 1.3 days. So first one, then the other passes in front of its partner. So whereas we got this light curve of what was apparently a single star in SuperWASP, when we examined its light curve, we found it's at least 4 stars. It's 2 binary stars. Now, that wasn't even the end of the story. We then went away and took spectra of the stars in this system. That means taking the light from the stars, spreading it out into its constituent wavelengths or colors, and seeing how that varies with time. And what we found there was that the lines in the spectral lines due to the different chemical elements in the atmospheres of the stars, were shifting backwards and forwards in wavelength, with the 5.5 hour period in one case and with the 1.3 day period in the other case. Now, this is an example of what's called the Doppler effect, which you'll probably be familiar with in the context of sound waves. You know that when a vehicle or a train or an ambulance, say, is coming towards us, we hear a higher pitched sound as the sound waves get bunched up. And as it's going away from us, we hear a lower pitched sound as the sound waves are spaced apart. The same Doppler effect occurs with light. So here, as the stars in these binaries are orbiting around each other, when one star is coming towards us, the light waves get bunched up and we see the light coming at a higher frequency, more towards the blue part of the spectrum. And when the stars are moving away from us, the light waves get stretched out to longer wavelengths towards the red part of the spectrum. Here, though, we know we got at least 4 stars in these 2 pairs, so we can measure the spectral lines in each pair moving towards us and away from us. And when we plot those as graphs, as shown in the middle panels here, we see the curves shown. These are what we call radial velocity curves. And what they show is the speed of each star as it moves towards us and away from us. There was one final surprise that this had in store for us. When we looked at the pair of stars that were orbiting each other every 1.3 days, there were 3 sets of spectral lines, 2 of which were orbiting around each other, moving backwards and forth as the 2 stars orbit each other every 1.3 days. But there was a third set of spectral lines there that didn't move at all, at least on the time scale we were looking over the course of a few nights. So that eclipsing binary star with the detached stars was actually a triple star. So there's 2 stars orbiting around each other every 1.3 days, and a third star that's presumably orbiting around that binary with a much longer period, maybe years or more, that we couldn't detect on the timescale we were looking. But then in the same patch of sky, there's another binary, the 2 stars that are in contact, orbiting each other every 5.5 hours. And these are all in the same plane, in the same line of sight as we're looking. That's why we see them eclipsing. So what this system is not 1 or 2 or 3 or even 4 stars, it's 5 stars. It's a doubly eclipsing hierarchical quintuple star consisting of a binary and a triple. The triple itself contains another binary and a single, and the whole lot are bound together by gravity in the manner shown in the right-hand diagram. So at the time we found this, and perhaps even still, I think this is the only doubly eclipsing hierarchical quintuple star known. So that was quite something to find. Now, I mentioned that another use of these SuperWASP variable star data is to look at catalogues of classes of objects. And here's an example of pulsating stars. Now, there's a class of pulsating stars called RR Lyrae stars, named after the prototype, the star RR Lyra in the constellation of Lyra. These are pulsating stars that typically have a period of about half a day, so they get larger and smaller, brighter and fainter on this time scale of about half a day. And there are several thousand of these known, but what we found with SuperWASP was another 5,000 or so, around 3,000 of which had not been previously discovered. And even the ones that were previously known, we were able to find out some new information about. One thing we were looking at in particular was a thing called the Blazhko effect. Now, this was discovered over 100 years ago by an astronomer called Sergei Blazhko, and it's still not properly understood. What it is we see these pulsating stars pulsating in brightness with a period of about half a day, as I say, but some of them show a modulation of that period, where the period itself, or the amplitude of the period itself, varies periodically with a much longer period of maybe 20, 30, 40 days, something like that. So these are periodically varying periodic variable stars. And we found about 1,000 of these stars displaying this so-called Blasco effect. And you can see how that manifests itself in the folded light curves at the bottom here. So what we've got are 3 sets of data on one particular star in the years 2006, 2007, and 2008. And if this star was a constantly pulsating variable, all of these light curves would line up with each other, and we'd see a single discrete pulse in each set of data. But as you can see, the shape of the pulse in height and in duration seems to vary throughout the year. So these light curves don't quite line up, and that is the Blasco effect in operation. Now, we still are not much clearer understanding what the Blasco effect is, but at least we've now got 1,000 new objects that can try and help us understand it. And in fact, what we think may be going on is perhaps all RR Lyrae stars may show the Blasco effect at some level if we can only look at them close enough over enough period of time and with enough sensitivity. So maybe we'll understand this eventually using the SuperWASP data. Now, here's where you can come in and help us with all this. As I said, we have these 30-odd million light curves from SuperWASP. And what I did a couple of years ago was do a concerted effort to analyze all these 30 million light curves to look for all the variable stars that are in there. It actually took me 100 years of computing time to do this. Luckily, I was running it on 50 computers simultaneously, so it only took about 2 years of real time. But having done that, I found about 750,000, 770,000 objects out of those 31 million that seem to display periodic variations in brightness. And between them, there were about 1.6 million potential periods that I found. Some of those, probably most of those, are not going to be real. They'll be artifacts in the data, but many of them will be real, and hidden within all those objects, there will be many unusual objects that might be just as interesting as the hierarchical quintuple system I just told you about. So what I've done with all these light curves is upload them to a website called Zooniverse. This is a citizen science project that was originally set up by Chris Lintott at the University of Oxford to look at galaxies. His first project was called Galaxy Zoo. On the Zooniverse now, there are many citizen science projects, including this one of mine called SuperWASP Variable Stars, and you can see the address for it there. If you just go to zooniverse.org and search for SuperWASP Variable Stars, you will find this. And what we ask you to do in this project is help us classify these variable stars from their folded light curves. So here's an example shown here. This, as you probably guessed from what I've told you previously, is by all accounts a pulsating star. You see the steep rise in brightness and then the shallow fall, and this one has a period of about 24 days. So when you go onto the website and join in the project, you're presented with a light curve, and you have to classify it as a pulsating star, as various types of eclipsing binary stars, as rotating stars, which is something I haven't yet talked about, and unknown types, or maybe just junk. And you classify it, then you get another one, and another one, and another one. And as I say, there are up to 1.6 million of these for you to classify. Now, we don't just rely on one person's classification of each star. We take a kind of consensus vote, if you like. Once each object has been voted on, classified by 7 people, it will be retired from the system, and the most common classification we'll take as the likely real one. And when we download the results from this, we can then investigate them and see what you found. This is a long project. This is going to go on for a few years, I'm sure, but over the next few years, we're going to start analyzing the results from this. And so anything that you find is really going to help us in understanding these variable stars as we go forward. Now, just as an example of one of the things that we found so far, which is being investigated at the moment. I mentioned earlier this contact eclipsing binary star, where we had the two stars orbiting around each other just every few hours. Now, there are many thousand of those known, and to be orbiting so quickly in every few hours, these must be rather small stars. Typically, they're red dwarf stars, much smaller than the sun. But what we found now is about a dozen or 24 light curves that look like contact eclipsing binary stars with this continuous variation in brightness. But they have periods, not of a few hours, but of many tens of days. The two examples here, the one on the left has a period of over 17 days, and the one on the right has a period of over 41 days. So if these are contact eclipsing binary stars with such long periods, they must be very big stars. And what we think these may be is red giant stars in close contact binaries. And if they are, these may be objects that are the progenitors of things called red novae. These are quite rare events where we see an explosion on a star that is very red in color. And the progenitors of these are believed to be red giant stars that get so close together that they merge and then explode in the nova. So what we think we may have found in some of these systems is these red giant binary merger progenitors of red novae. Now, we're still investigating these, so we don't really know the answer yet, but this is just an example of the type of thing that's coming out of this SuperWASP variable stars project with Zooniverse. So I hope that's inspired you to get involved in it yourself, and I do hope that you join us in this project and help us make some new discoveries. If I just stop the slides there. Thank you for watching this lecture about variable stars. I hope you've enjoyed it.